The midday sun hung high over Tsavo East, bleaching the sky into a pale, almost colorless blue. Heat shimmered in faint ripples above the ochre dust, and the air was still except for a thin, restless wind that stirred the grass in slow waves. This part of the reserve was open and bare, a broad stretch of savanna broken only by scattered thorn bushes and the distant shadow of a solitary acacia. The silence was deceptive. Life was all around, concealed in the grass, moving in whispers and brief rustles, but nothing loud, nothing hurried. The day was too hot for that. Ranger Samuel was on patrol, his steps measured and unhurried. He'd been trained to read this land the way some read a page, noticing where stems bent differently, where earth had been disturbed, where patterns broke. His eyes swept from the near ground to the horizon and back again, constantly adjusting. The grass here was waist-high in places, brittle and pale from the dry season, each blade bending under its own weight. Among its shifting shadows, Samuel spotted something out of place. A flattened patch, irregular in shape, with faint depressions leading away from it. He slowed, scanning the ground more closely. The tracks were small, the pads no bigger than a thumbprint, with tiny, sharp claw marks etched into the dry soil. A lion cub. The impressions were irregular, some close together, some far apart, telling him that whatever made them had been unsteady on its feet. Samuel's gaze followed the faint trail until, 50 paces ahead, he saw it. A still shape lying low in the grass, partly hidden by the stems. The sight gave him pause. In these open plains, lions were rarely alone, especially the young. Cubs of this age should be within sight of their mothers, often sheltered in thickets or kept close to the pride. But this one was exposed, far from cover. It was lying on its side, its fur dulled with dust and clumped into rough patches. The earth beneath it had the slightly darker tone of soil that had been pressed and warmed by a body for a long time. From where Samuel stood, he could barely see the movement of its chest. The breathing was shallow, uneven, and almost imperceptible unless you knew to look for it. He moved closer, lowering his body slightly as he walked, not out of fear, but caution. Approaching too quickly could startle an injured animal, causing it to bolt and waste precious energy. When he was within a few meters, Samuel stopped again, letting the breeze carry his scent and sound to the cub before he came closer. The cub's ear twitched faintly, the only sign it was aware of him. Its head remained still, its eyes closed. The frailty was clear now, the hip bones faintly visible beneath the skin, the outline of its ribs moving with each breath. Samuel's first instinct was to search the horizon for any sign of the mother. He turned his head in a slow arc, scanning every point where the grass rose or bent differently, where shadow could conceal a body. The land stretched empty in all directions, the nearest cover too far for a mother to leave a cub without risk. Lions were fiercely protective. Absence often meant one of two things. The mother had been forced away by a hunt gone long, or she had not survived an encounter. The cub shifted slightly, curling one front paw inward before letting it drop again. The movement was small, but it revealed something else, a raw scrape along its hind leg, the fur worn away, the skin pink and exposed. It wasn't a wound that would kill it outright, but it could slow the cub down just enough to make it easy prey. In this landscape, survival depended on speed and cover. Without both, a cub could not last long. Samuel lowered himself to one knee, keeping his movements deliberate and unhurried. The key was to show no sudden intent. Predators, even young ones, read movement before they read anything else. He spoke in a quiet, steady tone, just enough for the cub to register the sound. "Easy now. You're all right." It wasn't the words that mattered, but the calm in his voice. The cub's ears twitched again, the smallest sign that some part of it was still responsive despite exhaustion. Flies had begun to gather near the hindquarters, hovering in slow, lazy circles. Samuel knew that meant there was moisture. sweat, blood, or both, on the fur. It also meant the cub had been here for some time. Each hour spent lying exposed made it weaker and more vulnerable, not just to predators but to dehydration and heat exhaustion. The sun was relentless, and while lions could tolerate high temperatures, a young cub without shade or water was at a serious disadvantage. He weighed his options. Intervention was never taken lightly. Every ranger knew that removing a cub from its environment could reduce its chances of being accepted back by the pride. But leaving it here carried its own risks. If the mother didn't return soon, night would fall, bringing with it the chill of the dry season and the movement of nocturnal hunters. Hyenas, jackals, and leopards would all see an unprotected cub as an easy target. In plain terms, the risk of death by nightfall was high. Samuel reached into the side pouch of his pack and unscrewed a small water flask. He tilted it slowly, letting a single drop fall onto the dry earth just beside the cub's paw. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. The tiny tongue flicked out, tasting the dampness. He let another drop fall, and this time the cub shifted its muzzle slightly, following the cool scent. It wasn't much, but it was enough to confirm that the cub was aware, and more importantly, that it was still willing to respond. He paused, scanning the open grass once more. There was still no movement, no low rumble of a lioness calling to her young, and no shapes breaking the line of the horizon. That silence pressed the decision closer. Every minute he waited increased the chance the cub would slip further into dehydration, and if it collapsed fully, recovery would be much harder. If he chose to act, he would need to do so before the sun dropped any lower. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the distant snorts of grazing impala. Their presence reassured him. Large herbivores would not linger if a predator was nearby. It meant he likely had a small window of safety to make his move. But safety for him did not mean safety for the cub. Out here, its survival depended entirely on whether its mother was alive and close enough to find it. The reality was stark and simple. If the cub's mother returned and saw Samuel too close, she might not approach, and the cub could be abandoned altogether. If she didn't return, and Samuel left it here, the chances were almost certain that it would not live through the night. Either choice carried a cost. Samuel let his hand rest briefly on the dry grass beside him, grounding himself before making the next decision. This was the moment where observation would end and action would begin. The cub's survival balanced on it, and the land, as always, gave no clue which choice would prove right. Samuel approached with slow, deliberate steps, the dry stalks of grass whispering softly against his trousers. The cub lay in the open, its body angled awkwardly in the shallow depression it had pressed into the earth. The shape was small enough to disappear if not for the way the sun lit the dull, dust-coated fur. Up close, the signs of strain were more visible: shallow breathing, thin limbs, and a head too heavy for the body it belonged to. It did not lift its head when he neared, and did not give the faint growl or hiss he half expected. There was no fear response here, only exhaustion. He lowered himself carefully to one knee, shifting his pack to the side so it wouldn't scrape against the ground. In the field, speed was rarely the answer with distressed animals. What mattered was presence without threat. Samuel placed his open hand into the grass just short of the cub, letting it rest there without reaching further. It was a signal of proximity, a way to allow the animal to process his scent and presence before any physical contact. The cub's left ear twitched, the first acknowledgement since he had stopped moving. The wind moved in brief, uneven breaths, carrying the scent of dry earth and warm vegetation. As it passed over the cub, it ruffled the fur at the nape of its neck, revealing clumps where burrs had caught and tangled. Beneath the dust, faint rosette patterns still marked the tawny coat, subtle reminders of the spots lion cubs lose as they age. Samuel leaned forward slightly, narrowing the distance without casting his full shadow over the animal. His eyes moved over the cub's body, checking for visible injuries before anything else. The small scrape on its hind leg was clear, a patch of bare skin where the fur had been rubbed away and the surface abraded. There was no swelling, no sign of infection, but the injury could still affect its ability to keep pace if the pride moved. More troubling was the hollowed shape of its flanks and the definition of the ribs beneath its skin. A cub this age should have a slight roundness from a recent feed. Here there was only the taut pull of hunger. In wild predators, prolonged weakness often ended not in recovery but in abandonment, a choice for the survival of the group over the individual. Samuel extended his hand until his fingertips hovered just above the cub's side. For a moment he simply observed the rhythm of its breathing, measuring its depth and speed. The rise and fall was shallow and slightly quick, suggesting dehydration or heat stress. Finally, he let his fingers make contact. Light, steady, the bare minimum needed to feel the warmth of the animal's skin. It was warmer than expected, more than just the midday heat could account for. Mild dehydration could explain it, but here in the open, that condition could worsen in hours. "Easy. Easy now," he murmured, the words no louder than the sound of the grass shifting. He wasn't speaking for meaning, but for tone. Calm, consistent vocal sound could sometimes reduce the likelihood of sudden flight or defensive reaction. The cub's head turned fractionally at the sound, one eye opening in a narrow slit. Its gaze was unfocused, the pupils narrowing against the brightness. But the movement itself carried significance, a sign that it was aware of him, registering the intrusion into its space. It did not pull away. Instead, the smallest shift of weight brought its head a fraction closer to where his hand rested. It was not a strong movement, more leaning into proximity than a clear approach, but in a wild cub, even this was telling. Contact in the wild was a rare gift. It meant either trust born from desperation or a simple instinct to seek warmth when weakened. Samuel recognized it for what it was, a window in which to act before the animal's reserves ran out. His gaze lifted from the cub to sweep the horizon again, scanning for the mother. The land lay quiet and exposed, with no ripple of movement beyond the breeze bending the grass. Every moment she did not appear deepened the risk. In predator behavior, the absence of a mother could mean many things: injury, death, or being drawn away on a prolonged hunt. The longer a cub remained alone, the more the equation tilted toward danger. Samuel let his free hand drift toward the cub's forepaw, taking it gently between his fingers. It was light, the bones delicate under the skin, the pads rough but not cracked. He tested the range of movement slightly, enough to gauge tension in the muscles. There was a faint tremor, likely from weakness rather than pain. He noted it silently. Tremors in young predators often meant their energy stores were nearing depletion. Returning to the scrape on the hind leg, Samuel took out a strip of clean gauze from his pack. He used it not to bind, that would require more time and perhaps sedation, but to brush away the dirt and debris clinging to the skin. The cub flinched faintly at the touch, its breathing quickening for a few seconds before settling again. A soft, low sound escaped from its throat. Not a growl, but more the vibration of discomfort. Still, it did not withdraw. The eyes, now half open, tracked his movements in slow blinks, each closing of the lids longer than the last. This willingness to remain close, even in discomfort, was fragile. Any roughness, any sudden lift, could undo the thin thread of acceptance forming between them. Samuel let his palm rest lightly against the side of its neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath the fur. The contact was brief, but when he eased back, the cub shifted just enough that its muzzle brushed against his wrist. For a moment, he stayed still, acknowledging the motion without answering it. Somewhere to the east, a hornbill called once, the sound cutting briefly through the silence before fading. Samuel knew the sun would not stay high much longer. Each hour that passed meant more heat loss for the cub when night fell and more opportunity for nocturnal predators to find it. The decision before him was no longer abstract. To leave it here would almost certainly mean it would not survive the night. To take it could mean removing it from any chance of reuniting with its pride. For now, he had achieved one thing. He was close enough to assess its condition without fear in its eyes or fight in its body. It had allowed him to touch, to clean its wound, to linger in its space. These were not small steps. They marked the point where observation ended and the possibility of intervention began. The land around them remained indifferent, holding its quiet, but between man and cub there was now a thread, not of ownership or control, but of a shared moment in which the outcome could still be changed. Samuel stayed low, his weight balanced in the grass, scanning the horizon for the faintest sign of movement. The air shimmered faintly with heat, distorting the far line of the savanna. But nothing broke its stillness. He waited a few moments longer, holding on to the possibility that the mother might appear. A distant shape emerging from the brush, a shadow moving with intent toward this spot. But the plains remained empty. The longer he delayed, the clearer the decision became. A young lion, this far from cover in this condition without its mother close by, was living on borrowed time. The cub's breathing was still shallow, the skin along its flanks rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed too slow for the heat pressing down on them. Samuel shifted slightly, lowering his body so that his shadow covered the small form, giving it even a brief reprieve from the direct glare of the sun. The temperature against his knees reminded him of the ground's stored heat, something that would only drain the cub further if it stayed here. He had seen this before. The slow slide from exhaustion to collapse. The line crossed without noise or warning. If he left it, the outcome would be certain. If he carried it, there was at least a narrow opening for recovery. He reached out, his movements deliberate, one hand sliding beneath the cub's chest. His palm met the fragile bones and the soft but dust-matted fur, the weight immediately telling him more than his eyes had. The animal was lighter than it should have been, the mass of a body that had missed too many meals. The other arm moved beneath its hindquarters, avoiding direct contact with the small scrape on the back leg. For a brief second, the cub's muscles tensed, its head lifting a fraction in reflex, but the reaction faded almost instantly. It allowed the movement, its body yielding to the steady lift. As Samuel brought it against his chest, the cub's head turned inward, pressing into the fabric of his shirt. Its breathing warmed the space between them, a faint, steady heat that was more telling than any sound. He adjusted his hold so that the animal's weight was spread evenly along his forearm and side, his grip gentle but firm enough to keep it from slipping if it shifted unexpectedly. Standing slowly, he kept his knees slightly bent, ready to absorb any movement from the uneven ground ahead. A gust of wind passed across the plain, cooler than the still air before it, and with it came the deep, rolling calls of lions in the distance. The sound carried far in the open, a low vibration that seemed to move through the ground itself. Samuel turned his head toward it, pausing to listen. The calls could have been from the pride this cub belonged to, or from an entirely different group. In either case, the sound was too distant to be an immediate factor, and there was no guarantee the mother was among those voices. For now, the cub's survival depended on what happened in the next few hours, not on calls that might never come closer. The cub's ears twitched at the sound, but otherwise it remained still, its head angled so that one closed eye pressed against Samuel's shirt. This stillness was not the deep calm of rest, but the conserving of every fragment of strength. Samuel had felt the difference before. An alert, healthy cub would have shifted and resisted, even in the smallest ways. This one simply adjusted its weight once and then settled back. He took his first steps carefully, each one measured to avoid sudden jolts. The ground here was uneven, marked with shallow holes from antelope hooves and dry cracks from the season's heat. The grass brushed against his legs, making a soft, rhythmic sound beneath the low hum of the wind. Every movement forward was a calculation: his own safety, the cub's comfort, the speed at which they could reach shelter. Carrying the animal in this state meant it would be entirely dependent on human care until it could either be returned or reintroduced. In the wild, prolonged absence from a mother almost always reduced the chance of acceptance, but the alternative, leaving it here, offered no chance at all. As he moved, he kept scanning the land, his eyes making constant sweeps from left to right, near to far. Even though the open plains gave little cover for predators to approach unseen, he knew the risk of hyenas or other opportunistic hunters was never zero. The cub's condition would make it an easy target, and its presence in his arms was no absolute protection if a larger animal decided to challenge. His path angled slightly toward the direction of the ranger station, a place with shade, water, and the ability to monitor its condition, but he kept it broad enough that if the mother appeared, there would be room to adjust. The calls of lions came again, this time caught by a longer gust of wind, carrying across the flat expanse. Samuel marked the direction but did not turn toward it. The distance was still too great for any visual contact, and the cub in his arms gave no sign of recognition beyond that first ear twitch. His focus stayed on the immediate, his footing, the evenness of his grip, and the cub's steady but shallow breathing against him. At one point, a small insect crawled along the cub's side, navigating the clumps of fur where dust and burrs had tangled together. Without breaking stride, Samuel brushed it away with the edge of his thumb, an automatic gesture of care. The cub made no response, its body pressed steadily against him, conserving everything it had left. This lack of resistance was a constant reminder of the urgency. A healthy cub would have wriggled, resisted the constraint, or at least turned its head outward. This one stayed inward, seeking the warmth and steadiness of the hold. The savanna wind shifted again, lifting the scent of dry earth and sun-baked vegetation. Samuel's shirt grew warm under the contact. The cub's head tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. It was not comfort in the human sense, animals didn't seek reassurance as people did, but a practical, instinctive search for warmth and stability. Each step he took absorbed the unevenness of the ground, the weight in his arms feeling both too light for its species and heavier with the knowledge of its fragility. He kept a steady pace, knowing that slowing too much could stretch the journey longer than the cub could afford. At the same time, rushing risked jarring it or exhausting himself before reaching the destination. The balance between urgency and care was a narrow one. Out here, there were no quick fixes, just choices that pushed the odds a little higher or lower, choices made in the knowledge that nature could still overturn them in an instant. As the distant lion calls faded again, the plane returned to its quiet hum. Samuel adjusted his grip slightly, feeling the shift of the cub's small body in his arms. The open expanse stretched endlessly in every direction, the grass moving like water under the wind. In his arms was a life that, for now, was held above the uncertainty of this land, and each step forward was a temporary reprieve against the inevitability waiting if he had left it where it lay. For this moment, he was its shield, and the plains carried them both onwards in silence. Samuel adjusted his grip on the cub, feeling the faint shift of its weight against his chest as he began the long walk toward camp. The ground stretched in pale, cracked lines beneath his boots, each step raising a soft scatter of dust that hung briefly in the still air before drifting back down. The cub's head was turned slightly inward, its ear pressed flat against the fabric of his jacket, the fine edges twitching only when the wind passed over them. Its breathing, though still shallow, had settled into a slow rhythm, rising and falling in time with the sway of his stride. Every few steps, the small claws at the edge of its forepaw caught lightly against his shirt, an unconscious grip that spoke more of instinct than intent. The landscape around them was open, with only low, scattered shrubs breaking the line of the horizon. Samuel kept his eyes moving, scanning for any sign of the mother, for predators, for anything that might shift the balance of this journey. Each step forward was a decision he could not take back. The further they moved from the spot where he had found the cub, the less chance there was of a reunion. But with the heat pressing down and the cub's condition still delicate, standing still was no longer an option. Out here, a single delay could cost hours the animal did not have. The weight in his arms was light, lighter than it should have been for its age. Beneath the soft layer of fur was the sharp definition of bone, the thin frame of a body running low on reserves. Samuel was careful to hold it so that its injured leg rested free of pressure, his forearm supporting the rest of its body. He adjusted his breathing to match the slow pace he'd chosen, conserving both his own energy and the cub's comfort. The dust, rising from his steps, clung faintly to the cub's fur, settling into the rough texture already matted with earth. A distant call of a hornbill echoed across the plain, the sound brief but clear. The cub's ears twitched toward it, but its head did not lift. Samuel noted the reaction quietly. Even in exhaustion, its senses were still engaged. That was something to work with, a sign that the animal had not yet crossed into the deeper stages of collapse. But he also knew that this state was fragile. Dehydration, heat, and stress could tip it quickly toward a point where recovery would be far more uncertain. The risk remained high, and until they reached camp, the balance between stability and decline would be precarious. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint, distant scent of something animal, though too light to place. Samuel kept moving, his boots finding the firmer paths between the patches of loose soil. His mind stayed on the route ahead, the shortest way to camp without cutting through the low gullies where footing could turn treacherous. Each step was measured, each decision shaped by the awareness that a stumble could jar the cub or slow them enough to lose valuable time. After several minutes, the cub made a small movement, shifting its head just enough to press more firmly into the warmth of his chest. It wasn't a sign of comfort in the human sense, but a practical response to the stability of his hold. Samuel answered with the smallest adjustment of his arm, tightening his support without breaking stride. "You're all right," he said quietly, the words barely louder than the rustle of the grass at their sides. He didn't expect understanding. It was the steadiness in his tone that mattered. The sun continued its slow descent, the light flattening across the plain. Shadows grew longer, stretching away from the scattered shrubs like dark, thin fingers. Samuel kept his pace even, resisting the urge to push faster. The cub's breathing remained in sync with his steps, a steady rise and fall that he could feel through the thin barrier of his shirt. It was a fragile rhythm, one that could falter quickly if its condition changed. As the first faint outline of the camp's watchtower came into view in the distance, Samuel let out a slow, steady breath. The hardest part of the journey was still ahead, crossing the last stretch of open ground without disturbing the cub's tenuous calm. Each step was a reminder of how much was at stake. A young life carried between the wide, indifferent spaces of the savannah, relying entirely on the steadiness of his arms and the path he chose. The wind brushed over them again, carrying the dry scent of dust and grass, and the plain stretched quietly ahead, holding them both in its vast, unbroken reach. The air inside the rescue tent was still and shaded, a muted contrast to the glare and restless wind outside. Samuel stepped in, the weight in his arms shifting only slightly as the cub adjusted to the cooler space. He set it down gently on a folded canvas mat, keeping one hand against its side for a moment to steady it. The cub stayed where he placed it, front legs bent under its body, head low but eyes open just enough to follow his movements. The faint smell of disinfectant mixed with the earthier scent of dust and fur, a reminder that this place was made for quick, careful work rather than comfort. Samuel crouched beside it, unpacking a shallow bowl of water and a soft cloth. The cub's ears flicked once as the light sound of water reached it, but it didn't move closer. He dipped the cloth, wrung it gently, and began to clean along the fur where burrs and dry grass clung. Each stroke was slow, following the natural lay of the hair, loosening the dust without tugging. Small flecks of debris fell to the mat, the dull fur beneath beginning to show its tawny color again. The cub's sides rose and fell in the same steady rhythm, though every now and then a deeper breath came, as if the change in temperature and the stillness were helping it draw in more air. When he reached the injured leg, Samuel paused, letting his hand rest lightly just above the scrape before beginning. The skin was raw but clean, the edges of the wound soft rather than torn. It was the kind of injury that would heal quickly with care, but out on the plains could easily become infected. He took a small bottle from his kit, the clear liquid catching the dim light, and poured just enough to dampen a fresh piece of gauze. As he touched it to the wound, the cub shifted its leg slightly, a brief reaction to the cool sting. Samuel murmured low, "Almost done," the words as steady as his hand. The cub's head lowered until its chin touched the mat, but it didn't pull away. Its tail twitched once, then stilled. The rumble, when it came, was faint, more vibration than sound, but distinct enough for Samuel to feel through the mat beneath his hands. It wasn't a purr in the domestic sense, but a deep-bodied hum that young lions sometimes give when in close contact and at ease. He didn't stop working, but he kept his movements even slower now, maintaining the rhythm that had brought it to this point. Outside, the muffled sounds of the camp moved on at their own pace. A distant voice, the faint rattle of a metal bucket, but inside the tent, time felt narrower. Each action here was deliberate, meant to reduce the strain on an animal that had already spent too much energy simply staying alive. Samuel knew that the real work was only beginning. Stabilizing the cub now meant it could be hydrated and fed later, without the added burden of infection or tangled fur pulling at its skin. If he had found it a day later, these steps might have been too late. Once the wound was cleaned and a thin layer of antiseptic applied, he set aside the gauze and ran the damp cloth once more over the cub's back, smoothing down the last of the loosened dust. The cub's eyes closed for a few seconds, opening again slowly as Samuel withdrew his hand. It shifted its weight fractionally, stretching one paw forward, then letting it rest again. These small movements mattered. Each was a sign that its strength, though limited, was still there to be built on. Samuel stood, checking that the water bowl was within reach should the cub decide to move toward it. For now, it stayed in place, head lifted just enough to watch him. In the quiet space beneath the canvas, the faint hum of its breathing mixed with the lingering rumble in its chest. The light filtering through the fabric walls was soft and pale, holding back the heat outside, and the air carried the faintest scent of grass from where it clung to his clothes. The cub remained still, its gaze steady as though measuring the calm between them. Samuel stepped back once, giving it room, and in the gentle shade of the tent, the space between human and animal held a fragile, necessary peace. The camp had settled into its quietest hours, the small circle of canvas tents dim against the vastness of the surrounding plain. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and the distant sweetness of acacia blossoms. Inside the rescue tent, the cub lay curled on the folded canvas mat, its sides rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. Samuel sat a short distance away, his back to a wooden crate, a lantern at his feet casting a muted pool of light. Every so often he glanced at the cub, noting the subtle shifts in its position. A hind paw stretching slightly, an ear flicking in response to the low buzz of an insect. It was resting, but not yet in the deep, unguarded sleep of complete safety. The stillness outside was broken suddenly by a sound that rose from the far darkness, a deep, rolling call, drawn out and carrying over the open land. Samuel froze for a moment, his head turning toward the direction it had come from. He knew that voice. It was the unmistakable low roar of a lioness, not the aggressive, territorial sound of a challenge, but the steady, resonant call used to reach another across distance. In this hour, under the wide arc of the night sky, it carried a different weight, the tone of searching. He moved to the edge of the tent, stepping just far enough outside to let the night air fill his lungs. The call came again, this time closer, the deep vibration of it moving through the ground as much as through the air. Samuel's gaze stretched into the darkness beyond the edge of the camp lights. Out there, beyond the reach of sight, she was walking slowly, pausing to send her voice forward into the open, marking her position for whoever might answer. In the quiet that followed, he could almost trace the silence she would be listening into, waiting for the faintest reply. Behind him, the cub stirred, lifting its head slightly before letting it drop again. The sound had reached it, even if its reaction was muted. Samuel felt the calculation press in on him again. The choice between keeping the cub here, under care, and leading it out into the open in the hope that the call belonged to its mother. The risks in both directions were stark. If he took it and the voice was not hers, he could be delivering the young into danger. If he waited too long, the distance between the caller and the camp could grow until there was no chance of bridging it. He stayed still, listening. The call came a third time, slower now, the intervals between each note stretching out. It was not random. Lionesses calling their young did so in a pattern. A low, steady pitch that carried without aggression, meant to reassure rather than warn. He had heard it before on other nights and had seen the way cubs responded, their heads lifting, ears alert, and bodies drawn to the sound. But this cub remained quiet, too drained to act without help. Its stillness was not disinterest but the edge of its strength. The night around him was wide and empty, the stars above sharp and clear. The call faded again, leaving the land in silence but for the faint hiss of wind through the grass. Samuel turned back to the cub, its small form still curled on the mat, the injured leg tucked close. Every second was one in which the balance could shift, toward recovery and safety, or toward a missed chance for reunion. Out here, the right choice was rarely the certain one, and the night offered no answers, only the sound of her voice still carrying somewhere in the darkness, waiting. The first light of morning spread low across the savanna, softening the edges of the grasslands in a pale gold haze. The air was cool, the kind of fragile calm that came in the brief hour before the heat began to rise. Samuel stepped out from the tent with the cub in his arms, its small body warm against his chest after the night under canvas. The cub was more alert now, its head lifting to take in the shapes and scents of the waking land. It shifted once, the tips of its claws brushing lightly against the fabric of his jacket, not in resistance, but in a quiet readiness. He moved slowly toward the edge of the plain, where the open ground broke toward a shallow rise. The wind carried with it faint traces of the calls he had heard in the darkness, now distant and infrequent. His eyes scanned the horizon ahead, watching for movement that might emerge from the shimmering line between earth and sky. Every step brought them further from camp and closer to the unknown. If the lioness was still near enough to find them, this would be the moment. If not, the window for a safe reunion was closing. The risks were clear. Release here meant placing the cub back into a world where its survival would depend entirely on another's protection. But keeping it would mean removing it from its natural bond, forcing a life under human care. The cub shifted again in his arms, its ears turning forward, nostrils flaring as if it had caught something he could not yet hear or smell. Samuel paused, letting the stillness settle between them. A minute later, a movement broke the edge of the light, a shape low and deliberate, stepping from the cover of the tall grass onto the open ground. The lioness was lean but strong, her head carried low, her eyes fixed directly on them. Her pace was unhurried, but every line of her body held intent. Samuel lowered himself into a crouch, setting the cub on the ground but keeping his hand lightly at its side. The lioness slowed, her gaze shifting between him and the cub. The air between them weighted with caution. The cub made a low, breathy sound, then another, its body pressing forward against the light hold of Samuel's hand. This was the decisive moment. If the lioness did not recognize or accept the cub, there would be no second chance. He eased his hand away. The cub stepped forward, then broke into a short, unsteady run, its tail lifting slightly as it closed the gap between them. The lioness met it halfway, lowering her head until their foreheads touched, the cub pushing its small body against the curve of her chest. Her ears twitched once and she gave a low, chuffing sound, brief and deep in her throat. She stood still while the cub pressed in, nosing into the thick fur at her neck. Samuel remained where he was, watching. The lioness lifted her head once to look at him, her expression unreadable but steady. Then she turned, guiding the cub back toward the cover of the grass. The two disappeared slowly into the pale light, their outlines fading until only the sway of the grass showed where they had gone. Samuel stayed crouched for a moment longer, the morning air cool on his face, before straightening. The plain was quiet again, save for the faint rustle of the wind moving through the tall stems. The sun was climbing now, the day beginning, and somewhere beyond sight a young life had returned to its place. Samuel stood where he had crouched moments earlier, the coolness of the early morning air still holding back the heat that would come with the sun. The grass ahead swayed gently, parting and folding as the lioness moved away with her young pressed close to her side. Each step they took seemed to blend them more into the pale green and gold until only the tips of the taller stalks gave away their passing. The cub stayed tight to her flank, its smaller form almost hidden except for the quick, deliberate placement of its paws in her wake. Their pace was unhurried, not the wary retreat of fear, but the steady withdrawal of those who belonged to the land and knew the routes it offered them. Samuel's eyes followed their progress until distance began to make the shapes less distinct. He could still trace the slight ripple in the grass where their bodies brushed through, the movement like a soft signature written across the plain. A few meters further on, the cub hesitated, glancing sideways as if something in the open space behind called for its attention. Its head lifted, and for a heartbeat its gaze was fixed back toward him. The light caught along the faint line of its face, the small ears turning forward, the moment holding as still as the air round them. Then the head lowered again, and it pressed on, quickening its pace to match the lioness. The gap between them widened with each step. The wind, still light from the east, brought with it no sound now, no calls, no rustle beyond the ordinary sway of the grass. The cub was gone from sight within minutes, the lioness's shoulders vanishing soon after, both folded into the vastness they had come from. Samuel remained standing, not moving to follow, knowing that any closer presence would serve no purpose now. The reunion had been given its space. What came next would belong entirely to them. In the silence, his focus shifted back to the land itself. The reach of the open plain, the layered lines of distance, the faint shimmer already beginning where the air met the ground. This place had its own rhythm, indifferent to the decisions made within it, yet in rare moments it allowed for an outcome like this one. The risks that had hung so sharply in the hours before were still real. The cub's survival was not assured, but now it was no longer alone. And that alone altered its chances in a way nothing else could. Samuel let the quiet hold for a moment longer before turning back toward camp. The path ahead seemed unchanged, but the weight of the morning felt lighter in his steps. Behind him, the grass closed fully over the trail of the lioness and her young, the plain returning to its unbroken state. A faint stir of wind moved across his back, bending the stems in low arcs, carrying forward without pause into the distance.